There's so much outside the control of classroom teachers. Effective characteristics in our classrooms are one particular important factor that is actually set by the teacher. But to understand that, we must begin to understand what the word effective means. Now, effective means relating to moods, feelings, and attitudes. So, the emotional environment of a classroom can provide a safe and supportive learning environment for students, or the direct opposite. Effective characteristics of the classroom include linking content literacy with our students' lives, using adaptive instruction, and also providing choices. A strategy called Creative Thinking Reading Activities, or CTRA, offers students a chance to brainstorm solutions to a problem using their everyday knowledge that they've gained outside of the classroom. It tends to reward students for applying ideas from their practical store of knowledge to solve these school-related problems. It's a really good strategy to use when you're creating a favorable learning environment for all your students, particularly for language learning students and students who are less academically inclined. By bridging out of school literacies and content literacy, the learning topic is of a much greater interest to your students. Now, keep in mind that what counts as literacy and whose literacy should count is a debate that is had often in our field of education, but that debate is basically irrelevant because much can be learned about creating a favorable learning environment by simply observing the overlap between formal education and everyday life. Adaptive instruction is when a teacher releases the responsibility for learning to the students based on their abilities. Adaptive instruction is conducive to creating a favorable learning environment in content area classes. But it assumes that these 5 principles are happening when adaptive instruction is employed. So take a moment and scan through these 5 principles of adaptive instruction. Now, think about a scenario with your future classroom where you could use adaptive instruction in your content area, and how would you address these 5 principles that we just looked at? Remember that providing students with choices is always part of creating a favorable learning environment. Young people in our classrooms appreciate having a say in their education, just as anyone would. They also are more likely to appreciate a teacher's purpose for making an assignment when they have choices in how to go about completing it. So, providing choices can extend to the kinds of questions teachers are willing to entertain. And a willingness to hear the hard questions and sometimes very sensitive questions that students ask is very fundamental to exploring issues of social justice and also bias. Viewing language as a social practice calls for understanding what's meant by discourse, and that is discourse with a capital D. From James G's perspective, a discourse is an identity kit that governs our ways of speaking, thinking, and behaving in the world. People change their ways of speaking, thinking, and behaving when they move from one discourse to another. For example, when our students move from going to a basketball game to then attending a violin concert, their discourse will change between those two events. Claiming membership in a particular discourse at a particular time allows one to be recognized as part of that discourse and to recognize others like oneself. This has implications for how students speak, think, and behave in the discourse known as school. So, just as learning a subject matter can be described as learning a kind of discourse, it also learning how to operate in the world of school can be another kind of discourse. Classroom language, which is part of one's school discourse, can lead to stereotyping. Language that stereotypes can be found in student to student and teacher to student interactions, as well as in content area text of various kinds. And such stereotyping gradually narrows students' thinking and creates potentially unproductive learning environments. So consider that as teachers, we're constantly trying to grow our students' learning and expand their minds. And so if we are using discourse that is enforcing stereotyping, then we are actually limiting our students' ability to learn. Now think about a time when you did not know some aspect of the school discourse that's now obviously very familiar to you. And how did that work for you? Unless students find the content interesting, relevant, and worth knowing, they are not likely to engage with it, at least not in meaningful ways. Now, this is not surprising, of course, but finding ways to match students' interest with our resources while keeping state mandates and testing measure requirements in order, all of that is a big job. And there's no easy solution to this, but it is workable within guidelines of current thinking and teaching to be able to have a culturally diverse classroom. We're living in a time when adolescents' language backgrounds are becoming increasingly diverse, but their teachers are not very diverse. In fact, most teachers are English monolinguals, meaning they only speak English. Now, this fact, coupled with the growing diversity in race and ethnicity, that means that teachers no longer can expect to teach students who speak, think, and behave just like them. So they are not always sharing the same exact characteristics. Basically, the school discourse is changing, and teachers, as part of that discourse, have to change as well. So to improve our literacy instruction for our language learners, we have to understand some of the challenges that we're facing as we prepare lessons and as we work with diverse students. Listed here are some of those challenges. Take a moment and scan those. Now consider some of the barriers to integrating language, culture, and content into your specific content area. You always want to connect things to your specific classroom situation. And what are some possible ways around each barrier? Take a moment and think through that, because as you begin to develop ways to overcome those barriers now, that will make your life much easier when you have your own classroom.